Alex, thank you. Mark,
I actually think that we did lose Russia in a very real sense of the word. If you look back, I mean, as John said, I wrote a book which came out earlier this year, What Does China Think?, which was an attempt to try and capture the development of a Chinese worldview by talking to Chinese intellectuals and to understand how the Chinese see the world going. And in a way, China is the sort of counterfactual to the Soviet experience after 1991. It shows what happens if you don't send Jeffrey Sachs and a load of enthusiastic Western free market economists into a country with central planning and allow them to run riot and completely destroy the GDP so that it halves within a decade and causing social chaos and tensions left, right and centre. And I think if we want to understand where Russia is at the moment and where it's going and how it's got here, I think that it's worth actually looking at the internal Russian debates as well, and to see the people who structure Russia's thinking of itself and where it's going. One of the really interesting things about Putin and his Kremlin is that whilst lots of people focus on the spooks and the Sinoviki left, right and centre, he's also acted as a magnet for an incredible cadre of really impressive public and intellectuals and some of the most impressive thinkers that I've ever met anywhere in the world. I'm just going to talk about one of these people to illustrate the broader point about where Russia's going. There's a man called Gleb Pavlovsky. He's so sort of, I suppose if you're thinking about the American equivalent, he's a kind of cross between Karl Rove and maybe someone like Irving Kristol. He's somebody whose own development, I think, very closely parallels Russia's intellectual development over recent years. During the Soviet era, he was a dissident. He started out in a commune in Odessa, claims to have been put in prison at least 5 times during the Soviet era. Some of the people who are less friendly to him claim that he was also a KGB informer during that period. In the late 80s, he started working for George Soros as a consultant to the Open Society Institute, helping to set up civil society organisations as things were loosening up in the Soviet Union, spreading democracy. And then he kind of, at some point, switched over and ended up working for the Kremlin, where he introduced them to some of the techniques which Western democracy promoters were spreading across the post-Soviet space. Use of polling, political strategists, political consulting, and by the kind of the second half of the 90s, he was involved in fact, one of the leaders of what was called Project Successor, which was an attempt to extract Russia from the chaos of the Yeltsin years and to think about the future. And he took all of the things that he'd learned as a dissident and as a pro-democracy activist and turned them on their head in order to try and create a different sort of political system under Putin. He ran both of Putin's election campaigns, and he used a whole series of things, ranging from the sort of obsessive polling to all sorts of dirty tricks, from setting up fake political parties, running fake candidates, pioneered the use of the internet in politics within Russia. I think it was one of the people who invented the idea of media killers who would go out and destroy the reputations of alternative candidates. And he helped Putin create, I think, a new political system, a new social structure, and actually, eventually, even a new foreign policy, because he was also famously involved in running Yanukovych's campaign in Ukraine, which led to the Orange Revolution when it went wrong. So then was part of the rethinking of what Russia does in its neighbourhood after that went wrong. And I think that if we look at Russia at the moment, it's impossible to understand it without understanding the chaos that it went through in the 1990s, largely as a result of what we're doing. But it's also wrong for us simply to dismiss it out of hand without understanding what has been created is actually an intellectually coherent alternative system with a different type of... When they talk about sovereign democracy, I don't think it's simply an empty slogan. It is very much about trying to create a political system which is not determined by outside agencies, by the IMF, by the World Bank, by the Jeffrey Sachses of this world, but where Russia can actually make decisions for itself. And when they talk about democracy, I also don't think it's simply an empty phrase. It's certainly not liberal democracy. If you take the kind of Gettysburg Address about democracy being, of the people, for the people, by the people and for the people, it's the last bit of the Trinity which they focus on. It's the idea of delivering for the people and understanding what they want and creating it. And this political system which they have created draws a lot on a lot of Western critiques of representative democracy and liberal democracy. Carl Schmitt, for example, is a favoured reader of these people. Pawlowski set up a very interesting magazine called Ruski Journal, had a fascinating piece in it towards the end of last year entitled "Are They Reading Carl Schmitt in the Kremlin?" And I think they are. But anyway, so parallel, sorry, I need to wrap up. But I think in parallel with that, there is the development of a new social structure. So moving away from back towards, in their eyes, sort of an earlier version of Russian society. They think of Russia as a largely feudal system, which lasted throughout the Soviet era, which was briefly swept away during the 1990s and replaced with class warfare and chaos. So they saw the Putin system about recreating the feudalist states that existed beforehand. They passed 140 laws in the early Putin period, which created entitlements to all sorts of different clans that came out of the state. And then this new geopolitics and foreign policy, which Pawlowski likes to use the phrase counter-revolutionary technology as a way of trying to counter what they saw as Western expansionism as a result of the colour revolutions. This system is now under enormous stress with the financial crisis, and we'll see whether it's something which is really resilient and which will exist in the future. But I think it's part and parcel of a wider attempt around the world, as the world becomes more multipolar, to challenge the Western way of doing things with other ideas of progress, which are unattractive, certainly to someone like me who's a liberal Democrat. But which I think do pose a greater intellectual challenge than we necessarily think they do, and shows that the future is not going to be the end of history, but rather what Zbigniew Brzezinski calls a global political awakening, where Russia and China and other great powers will develop ideological alternatives to Western systems. And I think it's partly because of our own failures during the 1990s.
I knew there was going to be another clause.